the title of my talk, Learning New Jersey One Building at a Time. That was not my title. The council gave me that title in an attempt to, advertise my contribution to the Public Scholars Program as effectively as possible. But once I started thinking about it, I realized that it was, in fact, very appropriate. But what I really need to do as a scholar is to frame it a little bit. And if I had really chosen my own title, it would, in fact, be Learning from Delirious New Jersey, and for the architects and architectural thinkers in the room, you'll realize that that's a reference to two almost canonical texts of 20th century architecture and urbanism. Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas, an illustration of which is on the left, and Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York, the cover image, which is on the right, 1972 and 1978. I'm not going to take a deep dive into the importance of those texts with respect to how we think about the built environment. However, I just want to bring up two salient points. One is that in Learning from Las Vegas, Venturi and Scott Brown challenged, and they were specifically talking about architects, but they ended up exerting a great influence on a whole wide array of people writing about the built environment. They challenged architects and, let's say, architectural thinkers to redefine what architecture was and to redefine how we thought about the development of cities. They argued, in fact, that the Las Vegas Strip was just as significant as the conventional pedestrian-oriented downtown. And what they ended up doing was forcing a larger conversation about the meaning of what I like to call the attenuated metropolis. So that's on the one hand, that's the learning from aspect, so learning from New Jersey. On the opposite side there, we have Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York. His polemic in Delirious New York, which he called a retroactive manifesto for the culture of congestion, his polemic was that Manhattan, which was his shorthand for New York City, Manhattan existed as a condition of hyper-density and hyper-congestion that had as its most kind of monumental expression the skyscraper. And he made this argument in Delirious New York that although no one had really planned it, what ended up happening was that suddenly people found themselves living in an environment entirely created by man. So a completely kind of artificial and man-made environment, characterized by hyperdensity, characterized by verticality. In other words, the hyper-dense vertical city. Now you might be asking, well, what does that have to do with New Jersey? Well, here we are in the densest state in the Union. So I've been fascinated by this idea of density in this particular state and how we understand it, not necessarily with respect to conventional ideas of vertical urbanism, but how we understand it horizontally. What does horizontal density look like? So that's going to be the sort of touchstone, if you will, for what I want to talk about tonight. But I'd also like to place this into the context of our kind of local scene and make an argument that the image that we see here could be taken as our kind of a perhaps prototypical landscape of New Jersey's condition of hyperdensity. This is the culture of congestion writ across our attenuated metropolis. And of course, it's, as you know, we could see it as the kind of backside of Jersey City. And it's important for us because I would like to argue that and this will come up, as I make my way through my slides, when we think about urbanism, whether it's in Jersey City or in New Jersey as a whole, I think that it's good for us to remember that this is urbanism. That this is the metropolitan landscape, not just the more conventional notions of urbanism that characterize, for example, downtown Jersey City, particularly along the waterfront, which I'll get to in a moment. So this, for us, this could be imagined here as our version of Las Vegas Boulevard. Perhaps not quite as monumental, but I would argue just as significant. and worthy of our investigation. Not necessarily with respect to conventional notions of preservation. I'm not making an argument that the buildings that we see along there should be canonized or should be turned into monuments, but that doesn't mean that they are not significant and important. So my own polemic tonight is for us to think about what we mean by significant and important. But let's, as we begin to think about urbanism and architecture in New Jersey, I'd like to return to a recent past. These are excerpts from the WPA Guide to New Jersey, which was published in 1939. These are all from the introduction that sort of sets the stage for the volume, and I'm just illustrating it with a kind of random postcard of New Jersey. Greetings from New Jersey. This one from, I guess, the sort of late 50s or 60s. If we look at what's featured, chemicals, the Jersey Shore, and then right sort of above Passaic is a randomly floating bottle of beer. So anyway, situating us in New Jersey. But I'd like to pay attention to these three distinct quotes, and if you'll forgive me, I'm going to actually read them because they will be touchstones for us as well as we kind of circle back to all these issues. No phrase or nickname can supply an index to New Jersey, for in physical and sociological composition, the state is fundamentally diverse. It is often called the Garden State. With equal reason, it might be labeled the Factory State or the Commuter State. And that last one is particularly significant when you get to the next two quotes. Since the time when New York and Philadelphia were villages, New Jersey has been the corridor between them. Colonial post roads have evolved into the strikingly designed concrete highways and bridges that signify a motor-minded population. And if we skip down to the bottom, roads have been laid so straight and broad that the long-distance autoist speeds across the state, seeing little except a landscape of reinforced concrete and billboards, although many pleasant villages in a quiet country lie a little way off the main highway. I would argue that the reinforced concrete and the billboards are themselves significant landscapes for us to pay attention to. And then finally, the last little quote down there, the terms city, town, borough, and township are entirely meaningless as far as classification by size or area is concerned. The largest city is Newark with nearly 500,000 residents. The smallest is Corbin City with a population of 256. Now, it has totally escaped me what county Corbin City is in. It's somewhere down south. And I can tell you that in 2017, its population has almost doubled. And so it is in fact no longer the smallest burg, quote unquote, in New Jersey. Newark, of course, has sort of a population of roughly half of what it did in 1939. But I offer these not for us to kind of get caught up in demographics, although I'll come back to that, but simply to argue that what was true of the state in 1939 is astonishingly still true in 2018. All of these issues, this perception, a kind of outsider's perception of the landscape, the ideas of its kind of diversity that is not necessarily always visible to those who are driving on its highways. And then finally, of course, what is suggested, I would argue, by that last quote is this idea of a certain kind of, shall we call it, municipal density, a relatively small state that has 565 municipalities that calls into question sort of conventional notions of land use and settlement patterns. But let's step back for a moment and put this into a kind of conventional context with respect to architecture and urbanism. New Jersey has plenty of what we might call traditional monuments and traditional urban forms. We could, in fact, argue that there are parts of New Jersey, in Newark and in Jersey City in particular, that are, in a way, textbook definitions of Rem Koolhaas's idea of the culture of congestion. In other words, there are conventional urban places that can be categorized as possessing or characterized as possessing hyper verticality. I'm showing you, of course, John Rowland's scheme for what was built as the Jersey City Medical Center, which is some would describe it as the most significant collection of Art Deco buildings anywhere in the country. It deserves to be as well known as Rockefeller Center does, despite the fact that it's been, or perhaps because it has been repurposed into apartment buildings and is now known as the Beacon. So a conventional group of buildings that have conventional notions of architectural significance and also sort of exist within the realm of a conventional urban place. So hyperverticality is not something that is alien to New Jersey. We could even sort of pull that up to the present, and because, of course, the Jersey City Medical Center complex is not along the corridor that we think of as the site of the densest part of Jersey City, but we find that same verticality and density along the waterfront. Of course, showing you Cesar Pelli's Goldman Sachs Tower, that was a striking tower when it was completed, still is the tallest building in the state, although that seems to change every minute. On the PATH train tonight, there was an advertisement for a building that I swear wasn't there last week, that in fact is kind of just sort of in between two of the towers there. And even that image of the Jersey City skyline is different than what we see in the lower right, which is showing us the completion of Urby Jersey City in 2016 by Concrete Architects. So what we're seeing here is not merely isolated towers as the Goldman Sachs Tower appeared only a decade ago, but in fact a kind of canyon of increasing conventional notions of vertical density. But I'd like to argue that perhaps, though it might seem inevitably that this is at least Jersey City's density, I'd like to make, Jersey City's destiny, I'd like to make an argument that perhaps we should think of horizontality as the true destiny, the true urban destiny of New Jersey. And let's remember that what used to stand on the land or the landfill where all of those towers are now were, of course, the long piers and the wharves of the Jersey City waterfront, which were themselves kind of horizontal extensions of railroad tracks, of canals that turned both Jersey City and the metropolitan northern part of the state into the economic powerhouse that it was for much of the 20th century, until it had to kind of reinvent itself in the era of deindustrialization. So horizontality as destiny, that's what I'd like to sort of quickly move us through now. Making an argument, and this is my polemic, making an argument that as we think about the landscapes of New Jersey, as we think about what has significance, I want to make an argument that instead of us thinking about one of 565 municipalities, then in fact we begin to reframe how we think about the state. And that I'd like to make an argument that we think of something called the city of New Jersey. This is not my own metaphor. It was actually a concept that was introduced in the 1960s by geographers and demographers who were looking at this idea of intensified urban development. And they had already realized in the 1960s, something that we realize even more today, that the condition of the state is urbanized. And they were also thinking about the idea of a field condition of urbanization, not merely a series of compact downtowns, but this larger extended field of development. And it's that field of development that I want to look at briefly now. I should also say, as I'm making this polemic about the city of New Jersey, it's not as crazy as it might seem. New Jersey has about 9 million people, spread out or jammed in, depending on how you want to think about it, into around, 8,700 square miles. LA County has 10 million people, in true, about half that, about 4,700 square miles. But think about it. 9 million people, 8,700 miles, it's actually not all that crazy to think about this as a kind of continuous urban entity. Or perhaps we could even divide it the way it might be divided historically according to North Jersey and South Jersey. So that maybe there are two cities in New Jersey. I put this forward because it's a way for us to begin to think in what I believe is a more productive way about the nature of our built environment and how value accrues in that urban environment. Now, this idea of an urbanized field has been part of, I would argue, New Jersey's horizontal destiny almost from the beginning, when waterways and then canals and then stagecoach routes drew development across the state onward towards the two great metropolises at either end, Philadelphia and New York. And that field condition of horizontality and decentralization continued apace as transportation methods continued to evolve. So that, for example, we can think of the railroads themselves. In some ways, we think of railroads as centralizing because they all go back to a central point. But with respect to New Jersey's development, the railroads had the opposite effect. Rather than thinking about intensive developments, although to be sure, things did develop intensely in both Newark, Jersey City, and Hoboken, but that was principally because with respect to the railroad, because of their proximity to the city that was on the other side of the Hudson. So what we need to do is think about the way that transportation is stretching development out from these nodes, if you will, of most intensive development. And that brings us just to the edge, if you will, of our kind of contemporary situation. Because while we are still in New Jersey profoundly tied to the railroad, the development of the state, as we really think about it in terms of its horizontal density, is due to the automobile. And we're looking here at images that are from, on the right, from Jean Gottman's 1964 kind of influential tome called Megalopolis. In Megalopolis, Jean Gottman observed that a kind of phenomenon had emerged. And this is already by the 1960s, and he started doing this research in the 1950s. He observed that along the old historic corridor of the East Coast, along what was the Boston Post Road, what became US 1, that there was a kind of attenuated development. And that all of the old settlements, some of which went back to the 17th century, like the place that we are in this evening in Jersey City, that these had all begun to grow together to such an extent that it was no longer necessary to think of them as this city, and this city. Instead, what we needed to think of was the line of connection between them. And of course, the megalopolis, as he described it, the development of that continued apace. And another image from the WPA guide to New Jersey, sorry, not the WPA guide to New Jersey. This is the WPA guide to US 1. And we're looking at its cover image. And you can see in that kind of wonderful sort of slightly abstracted image, you can see where New Jersey is and the way that US 1 kind of cuts straight through the center of the state. And this is one of my favorite illustrations from that book. It's called US 1 Stretch of New Jersey. Even in 1930, the state was being conceptualized and presented to a broad public through this idea of the view through the windshield. And so I want to take that notion and kind of follow that with respect to how we get to where we are today. So this idea of horizontal destiny, predicated, of course, upon the development of an increasingly dense road system that was itself built upon an older system of plank roads and other kinds of chartered highways. Which, of course, is almost represented most intensely for us by the two major highways in the state that transformed development in the middle of the 20th century, the Garden State Parkway and the New Jersey Turnpike. It is impossible to underestimate the impact that these had on the subsequent transformation of the built environment of the state of New Jersey. But what I want to do is also make an argument that we need to think about the Turnpike and the Parkway and the rest of the transportation infrastructure as landscapes of significance in and of themselves, which is how they were understood at the time. They were recognized almost from the beginning as major works, not merely of engineering, but as certain kinds of civic monuments. Whether we go to the General Pulaski Skyway, which, as we all know, is currently being kind of rebuilt piece by piece, that was itself heralded as a marvel of engineering, but also as something that was itself symbolic of the urban development of the heart of what would become the megalopolis. Similarly, the New Jersey Turnpike, this is one of my favorite photographs of the Turnpike. It appeared in Life magazine, but actually was reproduced again and again and again. This is the stretch of the Turnpike as it rises up and passes through the Hackensack Meadows. Basically, the Turnpike was designed by the New Jersey Turnpike Engineering Department, but Roland Wank was brought in to do the detailing of these amazing columns. You never see these, of course, if you're on the highway. The best view of them is on the train, and I love that kind of collaging, if you will, of transportation methods. But I would argue that these are our monuments. These are our landscapes of significance. It doesn't mean that they are more important than those more conventional historic monuments, but I think we need to understand and value these as we begin to think about how the built environment continues to change even into the 21st century. Now, if the roads themselves, the highways, like US 1, like the Parkway and the Turnpike, if those roads were critical in establishing this culture of horizontal congestion, we need to understand that horizontal density has its own set of very particular monuments. And I just want to very quickly click through a few here, just to suggest to you, one, that they exist, and two, that they're harder to see, right? The horizontal monuments that I'm going to show you now, one has to seek them out because they're not literally as visible as a tower in the middle of downtown is. So we're looking here at some snapshots of the commercial block and one of the neighborhoods in Radburn, New Jersey, in Fairlawn, in Bergen County. This was a revolutionary urban plan when it was introduced. Its subtitle was Town for the Motor Age. It was not just that it was a town that was designed for the automobile. One could argue that any number of subdivisions were already being designed for the automobile. What it did was to reverse the logic of pedestrian and driver in order to create a place that was, in some ways, kind of one-off with respect to whether or not it got reproduced elsewhere, but was nonetheless significant for recognizing the way in which there needed to be a kind of separation of people who were walking or riding their tricycles, as you see in the lower image, and those who were driving. It was not attempting to reject the automobile. It was trying to make space for cars and for people out of their cars. So an important horizontal monument, if you will. Similarly, Lou Kahn's Trenton Bathhouse, which famously, of course, is not in Trenton. But it was built by a congregation, a synagogue that had moved out of Trenton into the surrounding areas. When you visit the Trenton Bathhouse today, which is now actually owned by Ewing Township and is run as a senior center, in some ways you have a hard time finding it because, as one of my colleagues said the first time we went, he said, "How do I know that it's that concrete masonry building as opposed to that concrete masonry building?" Because from a distance it just looks like a pile of cement blocks. But in point of fact, it is an elegant essay in abstract modernism, abstract and even heroic modernism. The Trenton Bathhouse is really just restrooms and changing rooms for the larger community center that was there. It is a horizontal monument par excellence. For Kahn, architecture was all about making place. How do you take even the simplest material, concrete blocks, and use them to transform a space into a place and to give the kind of urbanized field or suburban landscape of Ewing Township, to give that a place. And that's what he did in this in this building. And I think that was evident both in these kind of aerial views, but also in views like this when you see it from the satellite view. It's an attempt to make place, but doing it in a discrete way so that one has to seek it out to find this horizontal monumentality as it exists. Now, sometimes designers were more aware of the need for marking place. Oh, sorry, one more view of that. Just a combination of period and views today. Sometimes designers were far more aware of the need to mark place, and Eros Saarinen was profoundly aware of that when he received the commissions to design Bell Labs in Holmdel in Monmouth County. Hence, he uses the water tower there literally as a kind of beacon to mark it in the landscape, because he recognizes that otherwise it would be largely invisible. And indeed, it's how it is today, unless, of course, you're on the Garden State Parkway and you see signs for Bell Works, which is the kind of live workspace that is being slowly kind of introduced into not quite the shell of the building, but something resembling the shell of the building. Of course, Bell Labs itself was a creation of decentralization, because the old Bell Labs on the West Side Highway decided to move out to a larger and more secure location. And of course, many would argue that this is the place where modern telecommunications were born. If any place could be identified as one place, it would be here, where advances to microchip technology, et cetera, took place. It is in itself a field condition, a building, a large, almost megastructural building, placed in the center not only of a parking lot, although that's there, in a well-designed parking lot, and also in the midst of landscaping. But I offer this because this is a modernist monument par excellence in the suburban landscape of New Jersey, one that, like many others of this era, actually came to be known as a kind of ex-urban equivalent of the skyscraper. These were frequently called ground scrapers. And it's not a term that really caught on, but I think it's one that we should embrace, because it implies a level of attention to detail that I think many aspects of the built environment would benefit from. And just a few other examples of Bell Labs and the relationship of the kind of sleek glass skin to the landscape that is around it. Some views of the interior, where it's a kind of vast open space that in the center that allowed for kind of community gathering, and then the white-coated white men sort of in that lower right image, going back to their oh no, there's a woman. Just pointing that out. Going back to their individual workspaces, and a rendering of how it appears today. Some aspects of Bell Works have already been put in place. They're already starting to do things like have markets. They have a holiday market, showing films in the center, sort of like a drive-in, only it's sort of a walk-in, and an interesting way of thinking through. And this is something we were talking about earlier, the future of urbanism and urbanization in the context of a changing landscape and changing use. Finally, I would argue we need to consider our commercial landscapes. New Jersey is, and I love this period view of the Garden State Plaza in Paramus when it opened in 1957, because you see it so beautifully next to the highway interchange, next to a kind of perfect clover leaf. It is, and when you see it again in this image, you realize that the shopping mall and the kind of office park had much in common. They were these these large-scale, almost abstract buildings set into the kind of horizontal field of of parking. The difference between this and Bell Labs, of course, is that there was a landscaping as well. Here it really is just the parking areas themselves, with the original kind of pedestrian corridor designed as just that, a pedestrian corridor. And of course, the Garden State Plaza has been entirely rebuilt and changed, as has happened to so many of the early shopping centers and plazas. But it's important for us to begin to think of these with respect to how we value the landscapes around us. And I keep repeating that phrase, valuing the landscapes, because there is a kind of invisibility of these buildings. Few people realize that, oh, there was actually an architect designing these. Few people realize that they actually fit into a kind of, not just a sort of evolution of building types, but in fact an evolution of settlement patterns and of architecture. This slide I meant to actually take out, so let's just move on to here. I'd like to look at one final project very quickly. This is the work of Victor Gruen. Sorry, I actually did want to keep that there. The Cherry Hill Mall was the first enclosed shopping mall to open east of the Mississippi, as they say. In other words, not the first one to open, but the first one to open in our precinct, if you will, even though it's down by Philadelphia. Again, like the Garden State Plaza, it has been profoundly changed, but it's important to remember that it had a kind of architectural and urban integrity when it first opened. It was the work of Victor Gruen, regarded as the father of the shopping mall. Some aerial views historically that again show the relationship of the mall to the surrounding area. Cherry Hill Mall gave its name to the community, and I think that in itself is an important issue, that we tend to think of commercial landscapes as profoundly ephemeral and thus not necessarily worthy of preservation. And I'm not making an argument that these things should be frozen in time, but it's important to note that it was a self-conscious work of architecture. Gruen was really interested in modernist abstraction, and in fact saw his compositions as profoundly engaged with modernism and modern design as something like Piet Mondrian's De Stijl paintings. A few views of postcard views of the mall that again remind us that it was an attempt to create place. It was not just a kind of agglomeration of one store after another, but was in fact intended to be a place in a placeless place. And that extended to the graphics and to the community features that were there. Let's not forget that you can see there was a community hall. It was actually meant to be the equivalent of a conventional downtown. And here just a view of the mall as it looks today. Again, it has grown and shapeshifted so that Gruen's original mall is no longer even recognizable. But where does that take us with respect to our landscapes today? If we look around us, we see an incredibly diverse range of buildings and of strips. Not all of them reach the level of aspiration of the horizontal urbanism and horizontal congestion that I've shown you today. But I would argue that even the seemingly nondescript, and I would take exception that anything is actually nondescript, even the seemingly quotidian, that which we pass by so frequently that it is all but invisible, even that is worthy of our attention. These buildings themselves, while not necessarily all worthy of conventional designations of monumentality, they are absolutely worthy of our thought and our consideration, because in paying attention to these buildings, to these everyday landscapes, we are actually paying attention to how we got here and to the choices that we as a culture have made. I think I will end it there. I had one more. Okay, well, I was going to end on yet another polemical note by turning very briefly to the work of a native son. Robert Smithson was born in Passaic. lived here until he moved to New York at the end of the 1950s. He's best known for his land art installations like Spiral Jetty. But what's important to note is that in Robert Smithson's early practice as an artist and a critic, New Jersey played a really central role. And I think perhaps more than anyone, taught us that there was a different way to look at the environment around us. And so I would argue that as we think about learning from delirious New Jersey, that Smithson might provide us with a kind of methodology, one that ironically is utterly appropriate in this Instagram era. This is a series of, and I'm sorry that I put these, I've neglected to put the captions in here. This is from 1967. It's simply called Suburbia. And note what he's doing. He's finding value and interest at a series of very small scales. Everywhere he looks, there is something of importance, whether it is a texture, whether it is a whole building, whether it is something as apparently inconsequential as a series of swimming pools. These are images from one of his best-known non-land art projects called The Monuments of Passaic. He didn't mean that ironically. He was actually really interested in theorizing a new definition of monumentality. And so when he looked around and snapped all these, and these are only a few of them, it was a series of 24 images altogether, he looked around and made an argument about what has value and what has meaning. And of course, this was part of a larger project that ultimately, let me just skip over this one. He makes an argument that in the 20th century, see, I never skip over anything. In the 20th century, that in fact, we needed to learn that there were new values. We learned that with respect to sort of the glass and steel skyscrapers of, say, Park Avenue. We also needed to learn that with respect to the commercial landscape, and that both of these, which he talks about, not the TikTok diner in particular, but this is on NJ3, Route 3, I think? Yeah. He talks about Route 3. He mentions that in his text, that they each have values. We merely need to learn what those values are. And so he asks this again. It was assumed to be tongue-in-cheek, but in point of fact, he was making a really profound argument when he asked the question, has Passaic replaced Rome as the eternal city? He wasn't saying, oh, we don't build monuments the way we used to. What he was arguing was that our commercial landscapes, our industrial and post-industrial landscapes, our urban and conventionally suburban landscapes, that all of those have things to teach us about the world around us. And so, and again, I'll just end with another quote. He posted a sort of little advertisement in the midst of his article, which appeared in Arts Magazine. See the monuments of Passaic, New Jersey. What can you find in Passaic that you cannot find in Paris, London, or Rome? Find out for yourself. Discover, if you dare, the breathtaking Passaic River and the eternal monuments on its enchanted banks. Now, to be sure, it was already a brownfield, to put it politely. But he was also arguing that it had meaning, and that we might even find a kind of beauty in it. And so I will leave it there, and we can say, see the monuments of the city of New Jersey. So thank you very much for your attention.